Hello and welcome. Today we're going to see a brief video on an introduction to industrial design history, and I hope you'll enjoy it. So to mark the starting point of industrial design, we need to first think a bit about objects, man-made objects, and their history throughout time. So for that, let's think a bit about this kind of objects. It doesn't matter if they are primitive or more complex, what they all have in mind is that objects used to be made by artisans. So, made by an artisan made that someone was not just in charge of building the object, but also of deciding how it should be. So, this form, shape, and function of the object depended, or it was related to both the skills and the tools available for that artisan. And that was the case pretty much for a long time. But at one point in time, that change in that moment was the 18th century, and a very important process called the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was, as you might know, a process taking place first in England, but then throughout Europe and eventually the world, that radically changed the way we make stuff, the way we produce things, and then we start to see a shift for objects being designed by someone and built by someone else, and that's where we see what we can call the beginning of industrial design as such. And a very important date on this history is 1851, and precisely because at that specific year there was an exposition in London, the World Exposition in 1851, where objects from all around the world were displayed to be compared with the British industry. And on this exposition, on this fair, we can start to see a shift in the way objects are look in the way they are produced. So, for instance, if we focus a little bit on this one on the left here, it's a piece of furniture made in the UK. You can see that it has like all this aesthetic uh, figures, all these ornaments that in a way relate or refer to previous artisan made objects. And what's funny is that even though these objects look like they were made by artisans, on many cases this object used industrial production. So these objects looked like they were made by artisans, but still they were actually industrially produced, and on many occasions mass produced. But on this fair, we start to see objects that are specifically suited for mass production, for industrial productions. For instance, this sewing machine from Singer, from a U.S. manufacturer, it's obviously uh, ready, or better said, it was designed to be produced on an industrial level. So you have all these straight planes. The ornament is now just a graphic that's applied on top of the wood. You have gearings and all of that. So obviously this object over here, it was designed to be produced industrially, whereas this one on the left was not. And all this discussion on industrial production and craftsmanship, it's not just a thing about style or engineering. It was for many people also a political or a philosophical thing. So if we move a bit forward to 1870s, we have this fellow over here called William Morris, and he was not just a designer but also an architect, a writer, and a businessman. And he, along with other people, argued that industrial revolution not just brought a progress and scientific marvels to the world, but also created despair and horrible living conditions for many people at that time. And in a way, mass-produced objects or industrially produced objects were seen as guilty of that decrease or of that problem with the living conditions of people in England at that time. So his company, Morris.co, and the movement that they created that was called um, arts and craft, created objects like this piece, that this like this wallpaper, or this piece of furniture that were built using craftsmanship and handmade production in a way opposed to mass production and what they see as a new world order or a new production, a new way of producing things that was in a way taking humanity out of human beings. And 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 as we progress along time, we get into 19th century, more specifically close to 1905, and we get across the pond to Austria, more specifically to Vienna, and that's where this company comes from, the Wiener Werkstätte. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing it wrong. I have no idea of German, but that can be loosely translated to Vienna's workshops. And this company used or was used the help of designer like this man over here, Joseph Hoffman, and they produced a set of objects that were very significant at that time because they represent an aesthetic search for something different, to move away from the ornaments of the past to this old look of things. So they created this kind of objects that looked very modern, very geometric, and without any link to its historic past. So, for instance, this what's interesting is that this basket over here, like all many of these objects, they look like very modern and they look machine built, but they are actually hand built or built with the help of machines, but on a very low scale. So they were actually luxury items. So they were important not because they were massive, but because of its significance in in time and for times to come. They will be seen as a lighthouse to for the look of aesthetic qualities that would be coming in the next years. And so as we progress along time, we get also closer and closer to World War One, and we see one of the most important design movements of the time. It was called Art Nouveau, and that will be Art Nouveau, and that will be new art in French. And what's interesting about Art Nouveau is that it had local expressions or local chapters on many countries. So for instance, you would have Macintosh and all his geometric inspiration in Scotland. One of the most prolific ones happened in Belgium and France, and it has inspiration on biological themes. In Germany, you had the Jugendstil, like this one over here. In Italy, we have liberty as the local expression of Art Nouveau, and last but not least, around Barcelona in Catalonia and in Spain, you have modernism. So these are all different flavors, all different expressions of Art Nouveau happening at the same time on different regions and countries of Europe. And as we we get to World War One, there's another battle going on. In this case, it's taking place in Germany also, but on an association called the Deutsche Werkbund. Again, sorry for my German. This was an organization of artists, of designers, and industrialists for the advancement of the German industry. And this battle was was happening between two groups. The first one over here, whose main one of the main proponents was this guy over here called Henry van de Velde, and he was a Belgian um, architect, and he was a proponent of Art Nouveau. But more importantly, he was for the individuality of the artist. And that means in terms of for industrial designers, that means using industrial design or industrially produced objects as a mean of expression for artists. So they will defend his own view of the world from the world of objects. And on the other hand, we have a group of designers, maybe not headed, but one of his main proponents was Peter Behrens, and he was German also, and he worked for a company called AEG, or he collaborated with this company called AEG, and he's considered to be the first modern industrial designer. And this is very interesting because he not just created objects, but he also created architecture or corporate identity for AEG. He created many things. It was a very interesting collaboration. And in terms of the design thinking, or the theory of design, he was for standardization. And this was the main battle going on in the Deutsche Werkbund. Those who were for standardization and those who were for the individuality of the artist. And indeed, standardization in terms of industrial design means designing for the industry and designing for sharing common parts and using alternatives to create new products. It's basically design for the industry that will allow you to have a higher output in terms of different models and types, and it will allow a company to have a better performance in the market by offering a broader offering in terms of production. And so between these two groups, what happened is that this one looked much more appealing to the German industry. So they had a lot of support from there, and this group eventually won the battle over there. And this would eventually lead to the creation in 1919 of the Bauhaus School in Germany, and that will be the beginning of our next chapter. Thank you very much, and I hope you liked it. Bye bye. So for that, let's think a bit about this kind of objects. It doesn't matter if they are primitive or more complex. What they all have in mind is that objects used to be made by artisans. So made by an artisan, made that someone was not just in charge of building the object, but also of deciding how it should be. So this form, shape, and function of the object depended or it was related to both the skills and the tools available for that artisan. And that was the case pretty much for a long time, but at one point in time, that change in that moment was the 18th century and a very important process called the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was, as you might know, a process taking place first in England, but then throughout Europe. Hello and welcome. Today we're going to see a brief video on an introduction to industrial design history, and I hope you all enjoy it. So to mark the starting point of industrial design, we need to first think a bit about objects, man-made objects and their history throughout time. Europe and eventually the world that radically changed the way we make stuff, the way we produce things, and then we start to see a shift for objects being designed by someone and built by someone else, and that's where we see what we can call the beginning of industrial design as such.